Varsha, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a sense, and or should I say, give us an idea of your thinking here.
Thank you for having me over. Yes, you're right. The COVID cases are rising, and given the human impact of COVID, it does impact psychologically the sentiment. But what we see at Tamohara, especially since we look at long-term fundamental businesses with high cash flow generation, what we see is that it's the lockdown. We don't have a national lockdown now. What we have is weekend curfews and weekday restrictions. If these are short-lived, say till the end of April, we see the impact on GDP at about 1%. If we have a more long-term restrictions or a lockdown, we could see impact going to about 2% of GDP. And, we think then the entire growth story gets pushed back by a quarter or so, which if you look at long-term structural trends and fundamentally good businesses and the momentum on the ground, we've seen a catch-up coming back. And second waves are usually less stringent and bounce back faster. So we are following a very calibrated approach.
Okay, Varsha, the thing is that, of course, perhaps in the medium term, we will see that the economy bounces back and bounces back really strongly. The thing is, looking longer term, the damage from COVID could be quite extensive. In fact, I think that India has perhaps seen the biggest shrinkage in its middle class out of any country, and also it's hit the lower classes, if the working classes too. Does that worry you?
I think this time the government, companies, the distribution ecosystem is far better prepared. We have structural momentum that was put in place by a growth-oriented budget in place. And if the growth story is impacted, it would probably be a couple of quarters. Services, which is the large part of our Indian GDP, is intact. Rural economy, in fact, is doing quite well, as you would see the tractor sales numbers. And we think the structural drivers in terms of shift from unorganized to organized, the manufacturing story. In February, in fact, our ground checks had revealed that most of businesses were at 70–75% of pre-COVID levels. February was a very good month, and we think that the bounce back will be fast.
Varsha, are investors losing faith in Prime Minister Modi's ability to contain the virus, contain the new wave? What's been the impact in terms of market sentiment?
Well, yes, there has been a short-term impact in market sentiment, but as you can see this time, the government, the ecosystem of distribution, businesses are better prepared. What we are seeing right now, we are probably seeing a window where the infrastructure coming up and the medical supplies and the vaccines pick up is work in process. I can give it another couple of weeks and we'll see all that showing signs of scaling up.
Do you think it will push back policy normalization?
What we've seen is the policies are going on a parallel track and businesses as well are working as usual. Yes, COVID is a big distraction. Yes, it has high human impact. So it is a priority, but we think there is enough bandwidth for everything to move side by side parallel.
So, Varsha, when you look at these lockdowns, etc., we've also got this situation of the country forecasting a normal monsoon. That's going to be key here. Will a normal monsoon, not a particularly great one, actually underpin rural growth, which is going to be absolutely essential for a recovery?
Yes, rural growth is on track, and I think the monsoons will aid that. As you've seen in terms of the pickup in numbers and everything, rural has done fine. It has, in fact, on consumption, on the infrastructure build-up, it has been fine. So far, the good news on the monsoon will help it further. As well as this time, you have
the other thing, Varsha.
Sure, please go ahead.
Sorry, Varsha, I was going to say, I was going to just perhaps tie them together, what's going on in rural areas and also just generally speaking with the supply side of things. How much of this may contribute to inflation in the short term for the country?
Yes, with rising international commodity prices and logistics issues, we could see inflation inch up, but I think we have to look at inflation in the context of growth. As I had mentioned previously, at Tamohara, ground level checks have told us that businesses, ecosystems, governments has all collaborated. If there are supply shortages, they may be short term, but they will pick up, they will bounce back.
Varsha, looking at the equity market pre-open, down about 1.6% on a day. That's where most of Asia are trading higher. What does it take to reverse the sentiment among investors when it comes to the Indian market? I mean, started the year in the positive, and now that's been reversed.
Yes, you're right. The COVID news is an overhang on the sentiment. And the earnings results are pouring in. In the last week or so, we've seen about half a dozen companies declare their results. And as you see, the two sectors broadly, tech and broader financials, declared fairly good volume growth. The long-term story stays intact. If you even supply side pressures, what we saw in tech has enough cushion in terms of currency and the offshoring volumes that are increasing. In financials, the pre-results updates showed us that credit growth has grown by about 3.3 to 6% quarter on quarter. Deposit growth is 5 to 10% growth quarter on quarter as earnings roll out. And we see that businesses are resilient. I think that will draw attention back. The other thing to keep in mind is that whilst you have seen foreign flows go, there has been a strong support from the domestic flows. So the domestic investors are investing in the Indian markets, and the markets will see these short-term aberrations. For investors like us at Tamohara, which we look at businesses from a cash flow perspective, what we see is the long-term compounding drivers are intact.
Varsha, very quickly, we had a horrible open there, over 2% down on the Nifty. Taking a look at some of your top holdings, they're on the screen right now. We've been looking at the stock weightings that you have. How is your investment strategy evolving very quickly, and how does it really also reflect what's been happening for the last couple of weeks with stocks there under pressure?
Yes, so we are long-term investors. We look at businesses with strong competitive moats and high cash flow generation. We've seen a rotation in the Indian markets, but we would stick to our, our conviction on private sector banks, on housing allied sectors, on building materials, globally competitive sectors. And what we see is that we will take a calibrated approach. In the short term, we would probably stay away from businesses that need an unlock. But from the long term, we have a calibrated list and price levels, and we will add to the long structural stories.